This video is going to be a short introduction to logistic regression. So first I thought we'd talk about when would you use logistic regression. So logistic regression is just an extension of the regressions we've already talked about. It's going to be used when you want to predict the value of a variable based on the value of another variable. So for example, if you wanted to know if you can predict whether one will pass or fail a quiz based on their level of math anxiety, that would be a perfect question that would be answered by logistic regression. Here's what you'll notice. In that example, you have one dichotomous variable, meaning it has two possible options, and the other variable in that case is continuous. However, just as a side note, that other variable can either be continuous or dichotomous. We're going to talk about it as one as dichotomous and one as continuous, but know that that other option does exist. So let's talk a little bit about some of the terminology for these variables. You're going to notice that this sounds really familiar. The variable that you want to predict is what we call our dependent variable, or sometimes called your outcome variable. And that's the variable that needs to be dichotomous. Okay, so let's just talk about that just one more time. So your dependent variable, the one that you actually want to predict, has to be dichotomous. Means it has to be answered on a 2-point scale, like a yes, no, or a pass, fail, or a true, false kind of idea. And so in that example of if you want to know if you can predict whether one will pass or fail a quiz based on their level of math anxiety, your dependent variable or your outcome variable in that case is whether the outcome someone gets on a quiz, whether they pass or fail. And so you can see, because I've spelled it out, that it is clearly dichotomous because the two possible answers are pass or fail. Another example could be whether someone does drugs or not, or whether someone smokes or not, or whether someone's a parent or not. Those are other examples of dichotomous variables. Then the variable that you're using to predict the other variable's value is your independent variable, or called your predictor variable. And this is the one, remember, that I said can be dichotomous or continuous. And we're going to talk about it as the continuous one in this example, but know that it can be dichotomous or continuous. And so in that example there under the first bullet, your independent variable or your predictor variable is going to be their level of math anxiety. So it's their math anxiety score. And in this case, it's continuous. But remember, for logistic regression, it could be dichotomous. So you might ask yourself, okay, so I've decided logistic regressions for me. Now what? Well, we're going to talk next week about how to run it in SPSS, how to analyze how to conduct, I should say, a logistic regression in SPSS, and how to analyze it. But I want to talk about some of the assumptions. So there are some assumptions that you need to test. Most of these, let me see, the first 4 that I have marked there can pretty much be checked off in your mind based on how you collected the data. And then that last one can be conducted in SPSS. So let me just run through some of these. You're gonna say, man, I've heard this before because we've talked about it before, but I just thought I would just reiterate the assumptions for logistic regression because they're similar and a little different. So your dependent variable, of course, has to be measured on a dichotomous scale. I put 2 groups in parentheses. Kind of thinking of it as like the yes group and the no group, or the pass group and the fail group, for example, or the group that smokes and the group that doesn't smoke, for example. But it just has to be something that's measured on a it's measured on a 2-point scale. And then your independent variable, remember, can be continuous or categorical or dichotomous, I guess, is what I should have typed there to make it clearer, but can be continuous or categorical. You need to have independence of observations for the independent variable. What this says, those are a lot of fancy words, and I wish they'd just say what it is. What it means is that your independent variable has to be, you can't have people that like, not people. You can't have scores that do multiple observations, for example, like a test retest kind of thing. They have to be independent scores, for example. So like test anxiety is an independent score. And then you could also look at their content knowledge. That's an independent score, for example. Then kind of a subpart of that, but I've broken it out separate, is mutually exclusive and exhaustive categories for the dependent variable. Excuse me, I want to make sure I said this right. So what this means is that people can only be in one group. That's a fancy way of saying people can only be in one group. So when we talk about like a smoking group and a non-smoking group, you can't be in both groups. You're either, in this study, you're either going to be in the smoking group or the non-smoking group. You can't be in both. And then you have to have a linear relationship between any continuous independent variable. And that's something that can be tested in SPSS. The other four are really, I mean, could you look at them in SPSS? Sure, you can make sure that people are in one group and only one group, but most of the time those first four are something that you know just based on conducting your study. And then once you've tested your assumptions, we're going to talk about running the analysis, and that's what we're going to do next week. But I wanted you to be aware of when you would do a logistic regression, kind of a little bit about what it is and the variables it used. And I'm hoping that kind of adds a little bit to what you're reading this week. And then some of the assumptions that you would test in a logistic regression. And I put another little resource here, this website. You've probably seen it before in other slides. I like it just because it's kind of like a note, what am I trying to remember? And they used to have these books in English, like Spark Notes or something like that, like a quick little reference notebook for some of these analyses. And it says pretty much the nuts and bolts, which I love. It highlights the important things. So I always think it's great if after you leave this class, you have questions and you think, man, someone could tell me again what that was. This is kind of a nice little website to just refresh your memory. And what's also kind of nice about the website is it does have how to do it in SPSS. Granted, we're going to learn that in this class, but if later you're out on your own and you say, man, I'd really like to see some screenshots just to kind of help refresh my memory, this might be a great website to access. So this is that's a quick little mini lecture, if you will, on logistic regression. Remember, if you have any questions, let me know. And everyone have a great week.